Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the books I read in February and March. I did not do a February video because I wanted to upload all of my trip videos and get them edited, and then by the time I was finished that, it was close to the end of March, and so then I just decided to do one video for all of them. In February I read 13 books, and in March I read 14 books, so I have a total of 27 books to go through today. The first book I read is Shark Heart by Emily Habeck, and this is about Lewis and Wren, and in their first year of marriage, Lewis receives a diagnosis that is very rare, that he is turning into a great white shark. So as Lewis and Wren go along in their marriage, they have to make all of these adjustments as his body is going between human and shark, and all of those fins and breathing differences that are happening with his body. Also, as we go throughout this story, because Lewis is turning into a great white shark, that eventually means he's going to need to go live in the ocean. And Wren has just realized that she found the person she loves, Lewis, and so we also follow Wren going through this decision process of how can I be with Lewis in the ocean when he's turning into a great white shark and I'm still a human. And I just absolutely loved this book. It was just so incredible, and the themes of acceptance and love were just so prevalent in this book. The next book I read was A Stranger in the House by Shari, Lapena, and Tom and Karen are practically newlyweds, happily married. They're living in a house in New York, and life is basically going perfect for them. One day Tom comes home from work and Karen has vanished, and it looks like she has left in a hurry. She even forgot to bring her purse and her her phone and her ID. And so Tom is in the process of trying to figure out where she went, and while he's doing that, two police come to his door and they tell him that Karen has ended up in the hospital because she has been in a car accident because she was driving dangerously fast in an unsafe area of town. So this accident left Karen with a concussion, and she doesn't remember what happened the night of the car crash. And the cops think that is quite convenient for her because they think she was up to no good and committed a crime. When Karen and Tom get home, they really want to continue on with their life, but they are unsure about it because they come into the house and they feel like something has been moved. And also, Tom now is becoming he feels different about Karen because of the night of the accident, and she specifically can't remember what happened. He's unsure about what to believe, and this was an enjoyable book for me. The next book I read was The Bridge Home by Padma Venkatraman. This is about two sisters. The younger sister has a developmental disability, and the older sister isn't happy with how they're being treated at home, so they decide to run away from home. These sisters then find shelter on an abandoned bridge, and they meet two boys who they basically become, the four of them is like a little family. The boys, during the day, they collect trash to be able to make money, and the younger sister, she really loves making bracelets, so the three older ones have decided that in order to survive, they need to sell these bracelets to make money to be able to buy food and what they need to live. One day when they are on this bridge, there's this person that comes by, and they've seen this person before, and this person doesn't like that they're homeless and that they're kids, so he chases them off of the bridge, and so they have no place to live. So then they go and find a cemetery and they live there. But now the seasons are changing and it's raining a lot, there's a lot of mosquitoes, and two of them get sick. And so we follow this story of all of these four trying to survive life on the streets and just seeing where they end up and what becomes of them. And I just thought this was a really beautiful story. The next book I read was The Green Bicycle by Haifaa Mansour. This is about a girl named Wadija, and she lives in Saudi Arabia. She would really like a bicycle to be able to ride with her friends, and most of her friends are boys. And because she lives in Saudi Arabia, it isn't proper for girls to ride bicycles. And so her parents won't buy her one. So what she decides to do is she decides to save up a bunch of money, but she doesn't have any. So she decides to start a little business, and she sells homemade bracelets, mixtapes of band music to her classmates at school. But that's not allowed. So she eventually gets caught and gets in trouble. And then how she ends up trying to get money for the bike is there's this school-wide spelling bee, and if you are the winner, you get a prize that has an amount of money attached to it. And so Wadija has never really been that interested in school. She's always like broken the rules, and so in hopes of wanting this bicycle, she enters the spelling bee with hopes of winning this spelling bee. The next book I read was Minnow Pea by Mark Dunn. And if you've ever heard of the sentence, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, that is the shortest sentence that has all the letters of the alphabet in it. So what this book is these people are living in this coastal area, and I believe that sentence is like the top of their town hall kind of thing. And so one day one of the letters falls off of the town hall, and they're like, oh, those are the letter gods telling us that we're not allowed to use that letter anymore. So they have to take, like, for example, the letter E out of their vocabulary, and slowly more letters start coming off. And then there are also these punishments if you say or write these words or these letters. So there's two punishments. One is, I don't really remember what the first two are, but the third one is you get banned from the island, so you have to move away. And so it's really interesting, like there's a kid who says like a banned word for a banned letter for the third time, and this 7-year-old kid has to move away, but like his mom is like, well, I'm staying here. It was really interesting to read this story and just see how the author chose to write the words that we normally use with other words that didn't contain the letters. And it was just so fascinating because more and more letters just kept being not able to be used, and it was just such a really interesting book, and I really enjoyed it. The next book I read is That Kind of Mother by Rumaan. I didn't like this book. I rated it 1 star, and I'm just going to read my review, and that's all I'm going to say about the book. We follow Rebecca, who has recently given birth. She wants to continue her job as a writer, so she hires a nanny. Even though this nanny is hired, I got the impression that she played the parent role more than Rebecca, the mother. Then the nanny gets pregnant, and Rebecca is so desperate that this nanny will continue to nanny for her after the kid has been born. Her husband encourages her to think reasonably. Then, the nanny dies during childbirth, and Rebecca and her husband adopt the baby. The story gave me the impression that Rebecca was more concerned about writing than about her kid, so for her to just randomly adopt the kid without even asking her husband, who had major concerns, was too much even for me to suspend my disbelief in the story, and the book just continued to go downhill from there. The next book I read is Women of the Word, How to Study the Bible with Both Our Hearts and Our Minds by Jen Wilkin. I picked this book up in Florida when I was there in November. I really like Jen Wilkin's writing, so I knew I would really like this book. And Jen Wilkin just talks about in this book about how sometimes we let our emotions dictate what scripture means, and how sometimes we forget that the Bible is primarily about God and not us. And so she's reminding us here in this book how to study the Bible, both looking at it from your heart, but also using your mind as well. The next book I read was Redeeming Productivity by Regan Rose. And Regan Rose talks about the 5 pillars of Christian productivity. So the origin of productivity, you belong to God. The purpose, you exist to glorify God. The content, you are saved to bear fruit for God. The source, you are uniquely gifted by God. The motivation for productivity, you will give an account to God. And I read this while I was on an airplane, in some airports, and there are so many good things in this book, and I'm just going to share a few of them with you. If you've ever gone on a diet, you know the worst thing that you can do is keep your favorite snack foods in the house. It's the same with distraction. If you really want to live a focused and productive life for God's glory, you've got to put the things that tempt you to distraction far out of reach. But the reason we often fail to do this obvious thing is because it takes planning. It takes being organized, and the results of being organized are not always felt immediately. Everywhere you look in this world, you see fingerprints of God's orderliness. We see it in creation structures and dependable rhythms. The sun rises and sets, the seasons change every year, and gravity works the same on Tuesday as it does on Saturday. This is all because an orderly God made things that way. Though this world, tainted as it may be by the curse, is still so well ordered that the biblical writers even use its unchanging dependability to illustrate how we can depend on God's faithfulness to his promises. If you imagine the Christian life like a voyage of a ship, then God's glory is the destination. Whatever else may happen along the way, that objective doesn't change. You may alter your course and encounter dramatic setbacks, but the only criteria for success is whether you reach that destination. God's glory determines the aim of your productive efforts. There are many paths that you can take to get there, but each leg of your journey should be directed toward the goal of goals, God's glory. The ultimate purpose of your life, as we saw in chapter 3, is to make God look good. And your goals are an opportunity to show that God is a God worthy of your service. The next book I read, I checked out from the library of a cruise ship while I was on vacation. It is The Women by Kristen Hanna. In this book, we follow Frankie, and Frankie has a brother who has gone off to serve in the war, and Frankie would really like to follow in his footsteps, but her parents don't like the idea of a woman going to war. Regardless, Frankie signs up and she goes to Vietnam, and she joins as an army nurse. Frankie is very overwhelmed by everything she's experiencing because when her brother wrote letters home, he just wrote about all the good things, and now Frankie is very shocked. But she does meet some friends, and she gets to talk with brave people, broken people, lost people, and then Frankie eventually comes home, and that's kind of where the real battle begins, because she was a woman serving in Vietnam, and lots of people don't believe that there were women serving in Vietnam. And then when she gets a job at a hospital, it's mostly just like helping patients get up or changing bedpans, not really doing like the life-saving work that she knows she's capable of. I just loved this book so much. The themes about courage and friendship were just so evidently played out throughout this story. The next book I read is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, and this is also another book I read from a cruise ship library, and we are in Constantinople in 1453, and we follow an orphan seamstress and a cursed boy with a love for animals, and they risk their lives to protect the people they love. And then we are also in Idaho of 2020, and there's a storyline there as well. It's about an impoverished, idealistic kid who seeks revenge on a world that is crumbling around him. And I didn't really enjoy this book. I rated it 2 stars, and really my reason for not enjoying it was there were too many different storylines to follow that the whole book became so confusing. The next book I read was I Am Nujood, Age 10 and Divorced, and it is by the Nujood Ali. It's a true story, and I also found this book on a cruise ship, the same one as the last 2 books, but this book was in the free little library section, so you could take it home with you. So it was the very last day of the cruise, like we are getting off in 20 minutes kind of thing, and I saw it the night before, and I'm like, Dad, I need to go like pick up this book because I really want to read it. So I go pick it up. It's still there, thankfully, and then I come back, put it in my bag, and we get off the ship. And so then we're in Puerto Rico, and we have to sit in the airport for 6 hours because we don't really have anywhere else to go, and our check-in counter doesn't open for another 3 hours. And so I'm starting to read this book, and it's this actual story of this girl, and her father arranges for her to be married at the age of 10, and this is happening in Yemen, and I was just so like amazed to read her whole story. It was just so fascinating, and I think she was maybe only 11 or 12 when she wrote this book, and it was just such an interesting story to read. And I did enjoy the book, and I finished it before we got on the plane in Puerto Rico, and I'm like, it's a great book, but I don't really want to keep it. So what I did when I went on the plane was I walked down the aisle and I'm like, free book, free book. And I had to do that the whole way. We were sitting at the very back of the plane and nobody wanted it. And so then we get to our seat and I'm like, does anybody behind me want this free book? There were like maybe 5 rows. And the guy was like, sure, I'll take it. And I'm like, okay. And so now I gave him that book. And so that was just a really sweet memory of like reading it in the airport and then giving it to someone on the plane. The next book I read is At the Wolf's Table by Rosella Postorino, and we follow a 26-year-old named Rosa, and her husband is off fighting the war, and so Rosa is really lonely, so she decides to leave Berlin and go live with her in-laws. And one day, soldiers come and knock on the door and tell Rosa that she has been conscripted or chosen to be one of the people who tastes the food that Hitler's going to eat before he eats it, so that like if it's poisoned, it won't kill him. And also with the food tasting, there are a bunch of different ladies there, and they are given different things to eat, and so they eventually become really good friends because they are doing this thing that nobody else is doing. And also with the guard, one of the guards becomes really familiar, and then it's as if everybody feels like they're on the wrong side of history. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it would be more about just like the food tasting and stuff, but there was more than that, and so I just found that really interesting. The next book I read was The Naturals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. She also wrote the Inheritance Game series, which is the series I love so much, and so I also wanted to try this series, and it was also another series that I ended up loving so much. So we are following this 17-year-old girl named Cassie. She is living with her grandma on her father's side. Her father does not live with them, and her mother died a long time ago. And so Cassie has this gift for like profiling people, basically like knowing things about them and being able to decide like what they want and what they're thinking. And so one day the FBI come and tell Cassie that they would really like to use her gift, and in this program called the Naturals program, what they do is they use there's 5 teenagers, and they use them and their gifts to solve cases, cold cases from the past. So some of the other people we follow, one can tell when people are lying, there's another profiler, there's one who can read emotions, and then there's one who's really good at statistics and all that kind of stuff. Michael and Dean are 2 of the 5 people in this program, and Cassie comes into this program and she realizes that she likes both of them. And so there's the storyline of that. But there's this case that ends up not being a cold case, but an actual like live case in the moment. And so all of these naturals were just suddenly thrown into this case, and they have to figure it out or else their lives are in danger. And I loved this book, and I loved the entire series so much. The next book is Killer Instinct, and that was a really good book. I just thought it was a bit unoriginal because I felt like it played off a theme or the theme from the first book, but it was still really great. And then the other 2 books are, I know I'm not going in order anymore, All In and Bad Blood, and those were just so good continuations, and it was just so incredible, like the things that Jennifer Lynn Barnes researched to be able to write this book. There was also a novella called 12, which was the 5th book, but it talked about it brought in some of the characters from earlier books, so that was really neat to see that again. The next book I read is Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey, and we are following this person named Franny, and she has brought all of her research gear to Greenland because there's these birds called the Arctic terns, and they're going extinct, and she thinks it will be their last trip down to Antarctica, and she wants to follow them and research them. So she ends up talking her way onto this fishing boat, and this fishing boat, they're looking for fish and they haven't found any in the Greenland area. Franny tells them where these birds go, there are going to be fish because they need to eat. In the end, it comes through that she's chasing more than just birds, and if she will be able to move on from what she needs to move on to, or if it will come to her demise. And this was a really interesting book. The next book I read is The School That Escaped the Nazis, the true story of the school teacher who defied Hitler. And this is by Deborah Cadbury, and this was just such an interesting book. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, there was this school teacher named Anna Essinger. She saved her whole school. What she ended up doing was she got all the parents' permission, and she had like some other teachers that were helping her that were part of the school, and she moved her entire school over to England. And lots of people were like, why are you doing this? Like, Hitler's not that bad, just because it was like in the 30s and nobody really knew what was happening then. And so it was just so fascinating to read this story of like moving and then all the things that they had to go through after, and it was just a really neat read. The next book I read was Soldier Boy by Keely Hutton, and this is based on a true story of Ricky, who was abducted in 1989 at age 14 by the rebel army in Uganda. So this story follows when Ricky is in the army and then all the things that he has to go through. So we also follow this fictional character named Stanley, and because this book is based on a true story, Ricky has become the founder of the internationally acclaimed charity Friends of Orphans. So Samuel, this fictional Samuel, is a representative in the book, and has a story based around that for this true organization that Ricky had created. And I just loved this book. It was so good. The next book I read was Only the Beautiful by Susan Missener. And so we are in California in 1938, and Roseanne is 16 and she loses her parents in an accident. And she is her parents work at a vineyard. The owners of the vineyard let her live in this house, and Roseanne has a secret that she can see colors when she hears sound, and she promised her family that she'd never tell anyone about this. As she goes throughout the story, she feels really lonely, and she lets her guard down, tells someone about these colors and sounds, and she also ends up pregnant. So these people kick her out of the house, and Roseanne thinks she's going to this home for unwed mothers to help her become a good mother, but this place is far worse than she could ever imagine. And then we are also in Austria in 1947, and there's this lady named Helen. And so Helen was the sister of the husband who took Roseanne in. And so we follow this story of the war is getting really bad, and so Helen decides to come to California and to live with them. And so Helen gets to California, and I should also have mentioned that Helen had been talking to Roseanne back in 1938 through a few letters, not many, but enough to like remember her. Helen is talking to her sister-in-law one night, and her sister-in-law is talking about that no good maid they had, which happens to be Roseanne, because that's the whole reason they took her in, was so that they would have someone to be a maid after her parents passed away. And Helen was like, aren't you talking about Roseanne? And then her sister-in-law goes into all these like details, because she's drunk, of like all the things that Roseanne did and everything that happened, and Helen thinks this is so wrong what happened here, like how they kicked her out of the house. So then Helen goes on this search to locate Roseanne. And this story was so beautiful, the themes of redemption and friendship. It was just such a beautiful story to read. The next book I read was The Souls of Lost Lake by Jamie Jo Wright, and this book is based at a church camp in the summer. In present day, we're following a girl who goes missing. She's not at the church camp. There's a campground close by, but they get members of the church to help members of the church camp to help look for her. And so these woods, it's called Northwoods. And so there's this rumor going around from 1930 that Ava Coons, there's a ghost, and her name is Ava Coons, and she murdered her whole family. And so now it's like Ava Coon haunts the woods. So in 1930, we are following Ava Coon's story, and she doesn't remember what happened. We also follow Blythe, and she has lost her mother. She's one of the camp counselors, and she has had a dream, and she dreamed that this little girl was somewhere over by Lost Lake, and she needed help. And so Blythe really wants to go and see if the dream is true, and so she takes some people with her. And I will say before I go on, this is what I wrote in my review. This is definitely not a book for everyone. I was so scared at points while I was reading it, I started crying. But overall, I enjoyed the book. So they're going up to this cabin, or they're going up to this lake, and then they find this cabin. And so Blythe is with two guys, and they go into this cabin, and they're like, well, what if the girl is in here, kind of thing. And so they go in, they don't see anything. And then they go down into the basement part, and they don't see anything. But then they're looking around, and they see human hair. And that's the part where I was like crying because I was so scared. And I'm like, what's gonna happen? And so it was just stuff like that. And just this whole story was so interesting. But like, if you are someone who doesn't do well with horror thriller books, I would say this is not the book for you, but I still enjoyed this book. The next book I read was The Gardener of Baghdad by Ahmed Ardalan, and I actually had this author reach out to me on Instagram and say, like, if you read this book, which is a book I read in January, how about you read my book? And I'm like, sure, I'll put it on my list. And so this is based in Baghdad, and we follow Adnan, and he is a bookshop owner, and there is a war going on in Baghdad, and he is thinking about selling his bookshop. And in his bookshop, there is a section of books that is so special to him that he only lets people read those kind of books in his bookshop. He doesn't allow people to take them home and bring them back. And so one day he's over in that section, and he's looking at the books, and he picks one up and discovers it's a handwritten memoir. And he finds that so interesting to him that he sits down and starts reading it. And I just loved the story of this book so much. It was so beautiful. And just to see the memoir, and then it wasn't a finished memoir, where that eventually took Adnan through the rest of the book. And it was so beautiful to read. The next book I read was The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. This is about 4 senior citizens who live in a retirement village, and they meet up once a week to discuss unsolved murders. Now a brutal murder takes place right in front of them, and they are determined to find out who did it. The next book I read was The Sun Down Motel by Simone St. James. In this book, we follow 2 different storylines. The first storyline is of this girl who is on her way to upstate New York. She just picked up a ride with someone she doesn't know, and that person is making her very uncomfortable. And so she decides to ask him to drop her off at this hotel, which is called the Sun Down Motel. She goes and asks for a room, and the lady was like, my night person just quit, you can have the job if you want, but here's a room for the night. So she takes the job as the night person, and she works the job, and then shortly after she starts working there, she disappears. And so now we're going, 30 years into the future, which is most likely the present now in the story, and we follow her niece. And the niece, I don't specifically remember her name, but her mother has just died, and so this niece is taking some time off school because she wants to go find out more about her aunt. So she goes to this town just to find out some more, do a little bit of research, all that kind of stuff, and then she goes and checks out the Sun Down Motel, and then she ends up getting offered a job there, and so she works there, and she tries to piece together the story of how her aunt went missing. And it was just so incredible to read, and it was such a good book, and I really enjoyed it. The next book I read is The Unbreakable Boy, A Father's Fear, A Son's Courage, and a Story of Unconditional Love by Scott Lorette. So this is a father's perspective about what it's like to parent his son who has autism and osteogenesis imperfecta. I believe that's what it's called. It's when you have brittle bones and your bones break really easily. It was just going through the book and reading some of the father's moments that he had, and it was interesting to read, and I'm not really sure what to think of this book. I thought it was interesting, and I really like it when people are honest in their memoirs and share their true thoughts. But I honestly just felt like this memoir was too honest. Because his son has brittle bones, his bones can break really easily. And so just some of the things he shared about how his bones broke, if they're true, but I don't know if I'd want the whole world to know that stuff. So one day he was at the park, and he was on the swings, and his son that didn't have autism was pushing him on the swing and then going under. So you push someone all the way up and then you run under the swing. I think you know what I'm talking about. And so his son with autism was sitting right next to him on the swing, and after his other son did that, he looked beside himself, and his son is no longer there on the swing. So what he does is he jumps off the swing and he lands on top of his son and breaks all of his bones, or his back at least. I understand that his son had autism and he was worried about where his son could have gone, and how it is normal to jump off the swing, to go look for your son, but to make that into a story and tell the world, and that then you landed on top of him and you broke his back. I just think there are some stories that the whole world doesn't need to know. And so that was kind of my opinion of the book. It was a glimpse into his life, but at times I felt it was too honest. The last book I'm going to talk about is An Italian Girl in Brooklyn by Santa Montefiore. It's not the last book I read. The last books I read were books 2, 3, 4, and the novella by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, but I've already talked about those. So we're in 1979, and we follow this lady, and her name is Evelina, and she's getting together for Thanksgiving with her kids and grandkids, and just reflecting back on the 30 years that she has been in America for. And we also follow her in 1934 over in northern Italy, where she is a teenager and living her life, and her father wants her to marry someone wealthy, but she wants to marry for love. And we just follow her whole story of finding someone, and then does it work out, does it not work out, should she do this, should she do this, just the life decisions that she's making. And overall, I enjoyed the book. I also wanted to talk about the reading challenges I did. For the Read Your Bookshelf challenge in February, it had to have 3 or more objects on the cover. So I read Shark Heart by Emily Habeck. And then in March, there had to be a weapon on the cover, so I read Soldier Boy by Keely Hutton. For the Buzzwordathon in February, it had to have a keyboard keyword in it, so I read The Bridge Home by Padma, Venkatraman, and the keyboard word, like on a computer, the word I used for that was home. And then in March, the book either had to have this or that in the title. So I read The School That Escaped the Nazis by Deborah Cadbury. The Buzzword Cover Challenge, for February, it had to have a silhouette on the cover. So I read A Stranger in the House by Shari Lapena. And then in March, there either had to be action or movement on the cover. So I read Only the Beautiful by Susan Messner. There was a 52 Book Club February mini challenge. And so I read 3 books for those. I either had to read a book about crime or punishment, and I chose crime, and I read The Naturals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. Then I either had to read a book with Scarlet or Letter, and I read Elemental P by Mark Dunn, since it's about the letters of the alphabet. And then I either had to read Fourth or Wing, and I read That Kind of Mother by Rumaan Alam because it had bird wings on the cover. And then the 52 Book Club also did another March mini challenge, and it was a mystery challenge, and they had 52 prompts you could choose from, and you only needed 3. So the prompts I chose were a new to you author, so I did The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, and then I did An Amateur Sleuth, which is The Sun Down Motel by Simone St. James, and A House on the Cover, The Souls of Lost Lake by Jamie Jo Wright. And then I also just wanted to talk about the books of the Bible that I read, because reading the Bible is even more important than just reading these books, and it's the most important book you can read. And if you haven't read the Bible, I would encourage you to start. You could start in John. So the books that I studied and took more time in over the past 2 months were 2nd Chronicles, 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Psalms, and all of Hosea. And then the books that I read in February and March were all of John, parts of Acts, parts of Exodus, all of Deuteronomy, all of Numbers, all of Leviticus, all of Numbers, Psalms, all of Judges, all of Joshua, all of Ruth, all of 1 Samuel, parts of 2 Samuel, all of 1 Chronicles, parts of 1 Kings, all of Proverbs, parts of 2 Chronicles, and all of Song of Solomon, and all of Ecclesiastes. Those are the books that I read in the past 2 months, and thank you for watching.